Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is Talented Mr. Ripley. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of Talented Mr. Ripley with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. Talented Mr. Ripley is a 1955 novel by Patricia Highsmith, first in a series of 5 that span over a period of more than 30 years. Highsmith was an accomplished writer with 22 novels penned under her name. She was also quite an interesting and disturbed personality, and a lot of it might be reflected in Tom Ripley. Well, maybe not the killings, but perhaps there were some immaterialized desires. What she seems to share with Ripley is the psychology, obviously created by childhood traumas. There is loneliness, detachment, dislike, or even hate of people, and closet homosexuality connected to opportunistic sexuality to create an image beneficial to one's needs. She was not likable and not liked person, having nothing more than shallow and superficial relations with others. After her death, her publisher wrote, "She was a mean, cruel, hard, unlovable, unloving human being. I could never penetrate how any human being could be that relentlessly ugly, but her books, brilliant." Perhaps she was more willing than others to show who she was, probably because she didn't care what others thought of her. And maybe Ripley was the personification of how she saw the society. Highsmith preferred the company of animals, especially cats, so she could not have been all bad. I think a lot of what people saw in her was a result of a lifelong bout with depression and resulting alcoholism. She had some strong racial and ethnic opinions and seemed pretty anti-Semitic and self-described as a Jew hater. But a lot of her hates seemed to be motivated by what she saw as Israel's horrible treatment of the Palestinians, of whom she was an active supporter. What is Talented Mr. Ripley about? In one phrase, it is about the lifelong identity crisis and the resulting perfect crime, which, when looking at it closely, is far from being perfect. Half of it is the talent and competence of Tom Ripley, but the other half is his luck and the incompetence of others. It reminded me a bit Woody Allen's film Match Point. The book is also about self-hate, dislike who you are and where you came from, and as a result, an effort at transformation into another person, somebody who you like more than yourself and whose identity offers you a more desirable life. He hated going back to himself as he would have hated putting on a shabby suit of clothes, a grease-spotted, unpressed suit of clothes that had not been very good even when it was new. Also, there is the effort at trying to find your place in the world and make your life comfortable when the only cashable and valid talents you can offer the society are lying and cunning. Mr. Greenleaf was such a decent fellow himself, he took it for granted that everybody else in the world was decent too. Tom had almost forgotten such people existed. A bit of the plot. The title character, Tom Ripley, who is a young man trying to survive in a brutal world of New York, is approached by Mr. Greenleaf and offered all-paid trip to Italy to try to convince his son, Dickie, to return home. Ripley arrives in a small beach town, Montebello, which is fictitious and was inspired by a famous tourist village south of Naples, Positano. There he makes contact with Dickie, who to his surprise seems more interesting than he expected, and also meets Marge, who he suspects is in love with Dickie, so she becomes somewhat of a competitor. Ripley manipulates Dickie into believing that they have similar interests, and somewhat of a friendship develops. Later appears Freddie, a proverbial ugly American, whose friendship with Dickie makes Ripley jealous, and he sees it as a threat to his plans, so he as well is marked as a rival. Eventually, Dickie starts to see the real Tom Ripley and is not impressed, so he dies. Later, Freddie gets in the way and finishes just like Dickie. Disclosing the deaths of Dickie and Freddie is not much of a spoiler, since the thrill and suspense of the plot begins after it. For the remainder of the book, Ripley plays both himself and Dickie and tries his best to avoid the complications and dangers his game has created. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about Talented Mr. Ripley? I enjoyed reading it very much. It is one of the better psychological thrillers, and Tom Ripley one of my favorite fictitious personalities. Compelling and profound, in a way reminiscent of Joseph Conrad's or Graham Greene's characters, he might be even seen as an uncouth version of Hannibal Lecter. Somewhat of an anti-villain, he is deeply explored, with hinting references to his childhood. He was orphaned at an early age and brought up by a cold and distant aunt. It contributed to his detachment, selfishness, and self-reliance, and created strong fears of rejection and insecurity. And because of it, he seems to be searching for security, material above all. He loved possessions, not masses of them, but the selected few that he did not part with. They gave man a self-respect, not ostentation, but quality, and the love that cherished the quality. Possessions reminded him that he existed and made him enjoy his existence. Further, he thinks that because of his troubled childhood, he was short-handed by life and the society owes him something. He feels victimized by destiny and wants to be compensated. And if it is not freely handed over, he will take it by force. He remembered that right after that, he had stolen a loaf of bread from a delicatessen counter and had taken it home and devoured it, feeling that the world owed a loaf of bread to him and more. He learns quickly that life is brutal and the world is not very giving place, and is not willing to pay for his skills, at least not the amount he values them at. It could be also that his ambition is much bigger than his talents, and he also realizes that physical labor is not for him. So his only option is to plot and deceive. But there's also pride that sometimes gets in the way. He freely charges everything to Mr. Greenleaf's account except for one shirt, which he pays himself, probably to maintain some illusion of self-worth. Ripley also has a deep fear of rejection and tries his best to avoid it, but because emotionally he is not very developed, this makes him somewhat desperate, anxious, and even intrusive. He feels sometimes ignored by Dickie and Marge and becomes jealous, and the same goes for the friendship between Dickie and Freddie. Ripley creates personas which he thinks his targets would respond to and connect with best, but because his efforts are insincere, others eventually see through it. He tries to create a special and exclusive connection with Dickie. He proposes they travel to Paris in coffins, pretending to be corpses in order to smuggle drugs for a local drug dealer, and gets angry when Dickie doesn't go for it. He seems to have come to the conclusion that if you can't have Dickie, become Dickie, and it helped that being Dickie carries a lot of material perks. Becoming Dickie is desired, but also somewhat incidental, caused by small accidents, such as trying Dickie's clothes on and discovering how much alike they look, or being confused with Dickie by people who know them casually. Tom Ripley's criminal predisposition does not seem to be the result of him being a psychopath who kills for enjoyment, but rather a reactionary who kills because of circumstances and seems to believe it is an act of self-preservation. Would one thing after another come up to thwart him? Murder, suspicion, people. He hadn't wanted to murder. It had been a necessity. Actually, he seems to have some psychopath tendencies, since one of the main traits of psychopaths is lack of identity. And Tom Ripley's easiness and comfort in taking on different personality shows a lack of strong self-identity. If you wanted to be cheerful or melancholic or wistful or thoughtful or courteous, you simply had to act those things with every gesture. He's always acting, playing, and rehearsing so he can seamlessly take on other personas and make it believable. He's an actor, somewhat in a Shakespearean fashion. All the world is a stage and all the men and women merely players. He's a perfectionist, always polishing his skills, writing constantly letters to Greenleafs, many he never mails, using Dickey's typewriter because it types in a unique and recognizable way. Ripley is confused about his place in the world, and this creates a need for type of split personality. But it is voluntary and conscious, since he is always in control of his actions and never blacks out. Further, he really enjoys taking on a different identity because it lets him get away from himself, somebody who he really dislikes. This was the end of Dick Greenleaf, he knew. He hated becoming Thomas Ripley again, hated being nobody, hated putting on his old set of habits again, and feeling that people looked down on him and were bored with him, unless he put on and act for them like a clown, feeling incompetent and incapable of doing anything with himself except entertaining people for minutes at a time. Ripley really enjoys his new life under assumed identity, especially the material part of it. He travels extensively, which seems a bit as running away. He stays in nice hotels, rents luxurious quarters in Rome and Venice, and buys himself pretty gifts. He spends the money frivolously, perhaps motivated by the guilt for the way he acquired it. But there's also a sentimental side to being Dicky, which he explores. He writes letters to his parents, especially the mother, and sends gifts, and he feels like a son they never had, and they like parents he never had. Ripley's sexuality is ambiguous, just like the rest of his self. It is fluid, and it seems to be dictated by his other needs. He might prefer men because he grew up without a father and wasn't treated well by women, his aunt, but he comes across as asexual and uses it for self-benefits. As I mentioned, he might have homosexual preferences, but his other needs, such as comfortable lifestyle, come before. That's why Dicky died. Also, because of the world he inhabits, he might be hiding and resisting it. Probably similar to Dicky, who seems to be not accepting, even disguising, his own sexual tendencies. Tom laughed at the phrase sexual deviation. Where was the sex? Where was the deviation? He looked at Freddie and said low and bitterly, "Freddie Miles, you are a victim of your own dirty mind." Dicky, just like the other remaining characters, is not deeply explored, and because of it, he is portrayed as shallow, superficial, and spoiled rich brat, rebelling against his family because his life is too easy, looking for some adventures and getting away from his boring life in the US, also getting away from responsibilities and what is expected from him, so he can enjoy his frivolous life in Europe. Why should Dickie want to come back to subways and taxis and starch colors and 9 to 5 job, or even a chauffeured car and vacation in Florida and Maine? It wasn't as much fun as sailing a boat in old clothes and being answerable to nobody for the way. Dickie is a bit confused about his sexuality and because of it emotionally unstable and sensitive about his sexual desires. He seems to be torn between his homosexuality and trying to be normal because of his upbringing and environment. Ripley is a bit of mirror and he seems to see an occasional reflection of himself in Ripley's behavior, and it irritates, maybe even scares him. Marge seems to be a bit more explored than Dickie, perhaps because she stays alive longer. She's more similar to Ripley than Dickie, that's why she can somewhat understand him, and is also the one who comes closest to seeing the real Ripley. She's an introvert who must keep her intentions and emotions somewhat hidden. Also, she's a woman in the 1950s world, so she can be very obvious and needs to be discreet about her plans just like Ripley. Further, the two have something in common, the desire for Dickie, and this puts them on a similar path, but they go about it in very different manners. Freddie is the opposite of Marge, somewhat of an ugly American, loud, obnoxious, overconfident, very direct and confrontational, and obvious in what he is thinking, and that's why he had to die. To sum it up, Talented Mr. Ripley is a very well-written book with an engaging plot. It might make you reflect on the depth of your own identity and how comfortable you are with it. And perhaps if you would prefer to be somebody else, or at least have a lifestyle of another person, somebody you might even know. The problem is that our perceptions are often distorted, and what we see might seem better or worse than it really is. Perhaps our internal lives are not that different, so it is the superficiality of the other person's existence we are after. But most of the time, in the long run, the price for pretending to be somebody else is not worth it. Ripley is kind of likable psychopath, maybe because most of us can identify with him, at least his insecurities and wanting better life. He's a complex individual with many imperfections like many of us. There are a couple of adaptations of the book. The 1960s French film with Alain Delon, which for me takes too much liberty with the ending, and because of it misses the deeper message of the novel. Also maybe because of the social restrictions of that time, the relationships between the characters are a bit naive. The second adaptation, more famous, in no small part due to the actors involved, Matt Damon, Judge Law, Gwyneth Paltrow, Kate Blanchett, and Philip Seymour Hoffman, does a pretty decent job of relaying the book's mood. Some people even consider it superior to the novel, but it is not. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transformed into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A, naturally tan hide I buy from a tannery in North Spain. The same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First I designed the cover, and here I use a mid-20th century travel poster of the Amalfian coast where Positiano aka Montebello is located. There is a beach town with sailing boats, and in the foreground a rowing boat on a deserted beach, which relates, even somewhat symbolizes the plot. This is the back with the blurb, and inside front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel. And for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a great texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze, or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.